She stepped off the wagon with her chin up and half her face wrong, and the first thing she said to me, before hello, before her name, was that she couldn't promise beauty, only a loving home. I'd paid $3 and a train fare for a wife I'd never seen, expecting to be cheated, expecting to be sorry. What I did not expect was to stand there in my own dooryard with my hat in my hands and no words in my mouth, feeling like the one who'd shown up short. This is the story of the winter she came to my ranch, the child neither of us went looking for, and the night I had to choose between the only life I'd built and the only right thing left to do. I've told it wrong 100 times in my head. This time I'll try to tell it true. The kettle was screaming and I let it. I remember that, the kettle going and going, that thin awful whistle climbing the walls of the kitchen, and me just standing at the window watching the wagon come up the draw. My hands were doing something with a dish rag, wringing it like it owed me money, and I couldn't have told you why. A grown man of 31, 40 acres of hard grass and 100 head of the orneriest cattle God ever regretted making, and I was scared of a woman I'd never met coming up my own road. The kettle screamed, I let it. I want to set this down the way it happened, not the way it feels now with all the years piled on top. Because now I know how it ended, and that knowing wants to lean on everything, wants to make me kinder to myself than I was. But that morning I was not kind. I was a hard, tired, frightened man who'd sent away for a wife the way you'd send away for a plow blade. Because the ranch was dying, and I couldn't do it alone, and Mother had been 3 months in the ground, and the house had gone quiet in a way that got into a man and rotted him. I keep a ledger. I ought to say that up front because it matters to what comes after. Not a ranch ledger, I keep that too, cattle and coin, the way any fool must, but a private one, a little cloth-bound book my mother gave me when I was a boy who wouldn't talk. She said, Elias, you got words in you that won't come out the front. Put 'em out the back then. So I wrote things I couldn't say, still do. It's a poor habit for a rancher and a worse one for a husband, and I've filled a shelf of them by now. On the morning the wagon came, I'd written exactly one line. She'll take one look and want to go home. I'd written it the night before, by lamplight, and I'd believed it clean through to my boots. The wagon stopped. Old Delford drove it. He ran the freight and the mail and every piece of business that moved between the town and the outlying spreads, and he gave me a look off the box that I'd think about for a long time after. It wasn't a laughing look. Delford laughed at most things. It was how he stayed sane hauling other men's needs across 40 miles of nothing. But he didn't laugh. He just tipped his hat back and said, Elias, and climbed down slow and went around to help her. She didn't wait for the help. She came down off that wagon on her own, one boot then the other, careful the way a person is careful when their whole life is in the crate behind them, and she stood up straight and looked at the house, and then she looked at me. And I'll be honest, because I promised I'd try, the first thing I felt was the mean small relief a coward feels. There, said the coward in me. You see, she's plain. You needn't feel small. She was plain. There's no dressing it. She was a woman of maybe 28 with a strong jaw and pale, colorless hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. And down the left side of her face, from the temple to the corner of her mouth, ran the ruin the pox leaves, that puckered, pitted, silvered scarring that folks in that country looked away from as a matter of course. One eye pulled a little at the outer corner where the scarring tugged it. She was not beautiful, and she knew she was not beautiful, and she had clearly decided a long time ago to stand inside that fact instead of hiding behind it. And that decision, Lord, that decision was the most alarming thing about her. Beautiful women I knew how to be foolish around. This I did not know. She looked at me looking at her. She didn't flinch and she didn't soften. She waited until I'd got the whole of it, the scar and the jaw and the tight sad hair, and then she said, I can't promise you beauty, Mr. Vance, only a loving home. If that won't do, say so now and I'll ride back with Mr. Delford, and neither of us need be cruel about it. And that was it. That was the whole of it. And I stood in my dooryard with my hat somehow already in my hands. I don't remember taking it off, and I had absolutely nothing to say. The kettle screamed on inside the house. Her name was Marta Kell. She was from Ohio by way of two other places she didn't care to name, and she'd answered my advertisement 3 lines in a matrimonial paper, the cheapest kind, the kind respectable women weren't supposed to read because, as she put it later, a woman with my face and no money has a short list of doors, and I would rather walk through a hard one honestly than a soft one on a lie. I got the kettle. That was the first thing I did, God help me. I went in and got the screaming kettle off the fire like it was the emergency, and stood there in my own kitchen with my heart going like a spooked colt, and behind me I heard her step up onto the porch, testing the second board the way you'd test ice. "That board's loose," I said to the wall. "I heard it," she said. I made coffee because my hands needed a job. She sat at the table with her carpetbag on her lap like she still hadn't decided to set it down, and she watched me be clumsy, and she didn't fill the quiet with the kind of talk women filled quiets with, the kind I'd braced for. She just watched, and now and then she looked around the room at the pans, the woodbox low, the corner where the light didn't reach, the general fact of a house run by a man who was losing the fight against it, and I could see her cataloging, is the word, taking the true measure of what she'd come to. Not judging, measuring, like a person deciding where to start. When I set the cup in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it and didn't drink. "You're disappointed," she said, not unkind, just laying it on the table between us like the sugar. "No," I said too fast. "You are, it's all right. I'd have thought less of you if you'd lied smooth. That was a test, and you passed the important part of it. You didn't lie well." A small movement at the good corner of her mouth, not a smile, the place a smile might live if she trusted the room. "You lied badly, which means you'll be easy to keep honest. I can work with a man who can't lie." I laughed. It came out of me like a cough, surprised and rusty because I hadn't laughed since before Mother, and it startled us both. She looked at me then a little differently, filed something away. I felt it, the filing. "There's the ranch," I said, because I didn't know how to hold whatever had just happened, and I reached for the only ground I trusted. "You should see the ranch before you decide anything. I won't dress it up. It's a hard place and a hard year, and I've buried better prospects than these. My mother ran the house till September. Since then I've run it into the ground." I made myself look at her. "You came a long way to a poor man. I'd not blame you for that wagon." Marta Kell set down her cup. She reached up, deliberate, and she pushed a loose strand of that pale hair back off the scarred side of her face, toward the scar, not away, tucking it behind the ruined ear so the whole ravaged half of her was bare to me in the kitchen light. She did it, I understood much later, the way another woman might have taken off a wedding ring to show she meant a hard thing. "Here's the worst of me. Look at it plain. Now let's talk like two people who have stopped pretending." "Mr. Vance," she said, "I have been the beautiful thing in a house once before this." She touched the scar, one finger, no drama in it. "And I have been the useful thing in a house since. I will tell you which one lasts." She looked around the failing kitchen again, slow, and back to me. "I didn't come here to be looked at. I came here to be needed and to need back, which is the only trade I've ever found that doesn't rot. You need this house saved. I can save a house. That is not nothing. In fact, I've come to believe it's very near everything. A breath. So, show me the ranch, and stop apologizing for it. A man who apologizes for his home teaches it to be ashamed. I have never in my life, before or since, been so thoroughly handled, and I want to be clear that it did not feel like being handled. It felt like the first solid ground under my boots in 3 months. I stood there in my ruined kitchen, and I felt the strangest thing rise up in me, not desire, not yet, nothing so simple. It was relief, so big and sudden it was almost grief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a thing alone, finding out all at once that he might get to set half of it down. That night, after she'd taken the back room that had been Mother's, and I'd lain a long time listening to the unfamiliar fact of another person breathing under my roof, I got up and lit the lamp and got down my little book, and I crossed out the line I'd written. "She'll take one look and want to go home." I drew a line clean through it, and under it I wrote, and I remember my hand was not steady. She looked at me first. I didn't know yet what I meant by it. I'm not sure I know all of it now. But it was true, and it was the truest thing I'd written in that book in a long, hard time, and I blew out the lamp and slept better than I had since the funeral. I'll pass over the wedding quick, because there's not much to it, and because what came after is what matters. We married 11 days later in town, in front of the circuit preacher and Delford's wife, who stood up as witness and cried the whole way through for reasons she couldn't have named. And Marta wore a gray dress and no veil. "I'll not go veiled," she'd said. "I'll not start a marriage hiding the very thing I told him plain." And I wore my father's coat that didn't quite fit, and I said the words in a voice that shook, and meant them more than I'd meant anything. Folks talked. Of course they talked. There is no country so empty that it runs short of people willing to tell you what your own marriage means. Poor Vance, so desperate he took a marked woman. Poor thing, so marked she took a failing man. I heard the shapes of it in the mercantile and the church front, and I found, to my surprise, that it made me angry in a way I hadn't been angry about myself in years. Because by then, and this is the part I need you to believe, because everything after depends on it, by then I had watched Marta Kell spend 11 days inside my dying home and begin, quietly, ferociously, without one word of complaint, to bring it back to life. She mended the woodbox situation the first full day by the simple act of splitting kindling herself when she saw I hadn't got to it. And when I came in at dark and found her sweat through and blistered and grinning that half grin over a full box, and I started to protest that it was my work, she said, "It's our work now, and I don't intend to be cold on principle." She had the pantry sorted in 3 days into a system that made the winter suddenly look survivable instead of like a slow verdict. She found the leak in the north wall I'd been losing heat through and packed it with rag and clay while I was out with the cattle, and said nothing about it, and let me discover the warm room myself and figure out what she'd done. That was her way, I'd learn. She'd fix a thing and let you find it fixed, so the finding felt like luck instead of charity. She understood, in a way I've met in very few people since, that there is a kind of help that shames a man and a kind that steadies him, and the whole difference is in whether you make him watch. But I said this was a story about a child and a choice and a hard winter, and I've kept you long enough in the easy part. So let me bring the country into it, because the country was about to bring itself into us. Our spread sat up against the reservation line, the Apache land, or what the government was calling Apache land that year, which was a smaller thing than it had been the year before and would be smaller still the year after. They were forever redrawing it in offices 2,000 miles off, always in the same direction, always taking. I want to say this plainly because a lot of men who told stories about that country told them like the Apache were weather, a thing that happened to you, a hazard of the land like drought or wolves. That's a lie, and it's a lie I half believed myself until the winter I'm telling you about, and I'd be a coward to pretend otherwise now. The truth is I'd had dealings, small ones, over the years. There was an old man named Nate, not the famous one, another, a common enough name, who I'd traded with quiet a few times, horses mostly, and who was a shrewder judge of a horse than any white man I ever met and never once cheated me, which is more than I can say for my own people at that same market. I'd have called us not friends, because friends was too much and we both knew the world wouldn't allow it, but something. Two men who'd found each other honest across a line that wanted us to be enemies. That was rare, and I knew it was rare, and I mostly kept my mouth shut about it in town, and I'm not proud of the keeping quiet. That fall the papers I could get were full of trouble, bands going off the reservation, the army out, a great deal of loud print about savagery, and under it, if you knew how to read the small columns, the quieter and uglier truth, that the rations promised on the reservation hadn't come, or had come rotten, or had come and been sold off by the very men paid to distribute them, and that people were starving inside a fence, and that some of them had decided they'd rather die running than die penned. I read those columns by lamplight, and I read them to Marta, because she asked me to, because she wanted to understand the country she'd married into. And I watched her face, the whole of it, scar and all, go still and hard in a way I was coming to know meant she'd decided something. "They're starving them," she said, flat, "and calling them animals for acting starved." "It's more tangled than that," I said, because it was the thing men said. "It usually is," she said. "That's how a thing that simple stays going, you tangle it." She looked at the fire a while. "My mother died in a poorhouse that had food in the cellar, Elias. I know what it is to be starved by a man's bookkeeping. Don't tell me it's tangled." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say to that. The first snow came early and mean, the third week of November, and it came down for 2 days without a breath of let-up, and it buried the country to the fen stops and killed 9 of my cattle where they stood and locked the whole hard, beautiful world in white and silence. And it was on the second night of that storm, with the wind screaming down the draw the way that Kettle had screamed the morning she came. I noticed that, the echo, and I've never stopped noticing it, that I heard the dog. We had a dog, an old rangy gray thing named Job who'd come with the ranch and would outlast it, and Job did not bark at weather. Job had made his peace with weather. So when Job started up out in the storm, low and steady and pointed, both Marta and I were on our feet before the second round, and I had the rifle down off the pegs before I'd thought about it, and she had the lamp, and we stood at the door in the killing cold listening. "Somebody's out there," she said. "Nobody's out there," I said. "Nobody's out in this, nothing living." But Job knew different, and dogs are better than men at the important things, and when I hauled the door open against the wind and threw the lamplight out into the white, the storm gave me back, for just a second, a shape. Small, the shape was small. Down at the edge of the light, half drifted over, not moving the way a grown person moves, moving the way a thing moves that has decided it's done moving, and is only twitching because the body won't quite agree to quit. It was a child. I want to slow down here, because this was the hinge of my whole life, and I didn't know it. And a man ought to slow down at the hinge of his life, even if he only gets to do it after, in the telling. I went out into it. Marta came right behind me with the lamp. I told her to stay, and she didn't so much as answer me, which was already the shape of our whole marriage in one moment. And we fought maybe 30 feet of drift that felt like 30 miles. And I got down and got my arms under the child, and it was so light. God, it was so terribly light. And it was an Apache girl of maybe 7 years old, in clothing meant for a warmer world. Her lips gone gray, her eyes half open and looking at nothing. And around her one wrist, tied with a strip of red cloth, was a small carved thing on a cord, a horse, a little wooden horse, worn smooth with handling. I knew that carving. I'd watched the hands that made it. Old Nate whittled horses. He'd given me one once, over trade, and it sat on my mantel that very night. I didn't say any of that out loud in the storm. There wasn't breath for it. But I looked at Marta over the child's gray face, and Marta looked at me, and she saw that I knew something, and she filed it, the way she filed everything, to be asked about later when there was warmth and time. "Inside," she said, "now talk after she dies while you think." So we carried her in, and we shut the door on the screaming dark. And that, the closing of that door, with an Apache child in my wife's arms and a wooden horse I recognized on a cord round the child's wrist, and the whole weight of the world's meanness locked out in the snow for one more hour, that was the true beginning. Everything before it was only how we came to be the two people standing in that room. The story I have to tell you starts with the click of that latch. Marta had the child on the hearthrug and stripped of the frozen clothes and wrapped in every quilt in the house before I'd got the door barred. She worked the way she did everything, fast and sure and without a wasted motion, and she was talking low the whole time, not to me, to the child, a steady murmur of "there now, there, you're inside, stay with me now," in a voice I'd not heard her use, a voice from before the poorhouse and the pox and the matrimonial paper, a voice with a whole buried life in it. And I stood there useless with the rifle still in my hand, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me, She's done this before. She's held a dying child before. And I put that away too to ask about later in the warmth when there was time. We didn't sleep. We rubbed the life back into that small body an inch at a time. We got warm broth past those gray lips a drop at a time. We watched the color come back so slow it hardly looked like coming. And somewhere in the blackest part of that night, the child's eyes came open. All the way open, focused, terrified, and fixed on my wife's ruined face bent close over her in the lamplight. And the child did not flinch. I'll never forget it. Every soul in that country flinched from Marta's face at least the first time. Every grown man and church woman and merchant who thought himself too good to show it and showed it anyway. And this half-frozen Apache child of 7, coming up out of the dark at death's own doorsill, opened her eyes on the most fearsome-looking stranger of her short life, and reached up one small hand, and touched the scarred cheek, gentle, like she was checking it was real. Like she'd found in the whole terrifying world, the one face that had also been hurt and lived. Marta made a sound. I won't try to spell it. And she caught that small hand against her ruined cheek and held it there, and she looked up at me across the firelight with tears standing in both her eyes, the pulled one and the good one, both. And she said the second thing she ever said that struck me speechless, and it was so quiet I near missed it under the wind. Elias, I know what you're going to have to decide, and I know it's your ranch and your neck and your people out there who'll hate us for it. A breath. But I've held a dead child in this life already. I'll not hold a second one to keep the peace with men who'd let her freeze. Whatever it costs, I'll not. Out in the snow, faint under the storm, Job started barking again. There was somebody else out there. The second shape in the snow wasn't down. That was the first thing my body understood before my mind caught up. The first shape had been a thing collapsing, a thing the storm had already half won. This second one was upright. It came out of the white at the edge of Job's noise standing, swaying but standing, and it had a rifle, and it brought the rifle up when the lamplight found it. And for one long breath the two of us stood 30 feet apart in a killing wind with our guns on each other and a child's life warming on the hearth behind me. Then the wind shifted the snow between us like a curtain pulling back, and I saw the face over the rifle, and the face was old, and I knew it. "Nate," I said. It came out of me on a cloud of breath and got torn away by the wind, but he saw my mouth make it. I lowered my rifle. I did it slow, so he'd see the choice in it, so he'd know it wasn't fumbling. And I did the thing that no sane man in that country would have told me to do. I turned my back on an armed Apache in the dark and I walked toward my own door, and I lifted a hand for him to follow, and I trusted him with the whole soft back of me across 30 feet of snow. I heard him come. That's all. I heard the crunch of him coming, slow and staggering, and then he was in the doorway behind me, and I barred the door on the storm a second time that night, and I turned around, and old Nate stood dripping in my kitchen looking not at me, looking past me at the hearth, at the small quill-trapped shape, and the pale, scarred woman bent over it. And every year of his hard life came down over his face at once and his knees went, and I caught him before he hit the floor. He was not hurt. Or he was hurt the way the child was hurt, by cold, by hunger, by miles. He'd been 3 days coming through country that was trying to kill him, and he'd been coming because the child was his granddaughter, and he'd lost her tracks in the first night's storm and found them again, and lost them, and kept coming on the pure animal refusal of a man who has already buried too many of his own to bury one more without a fight. Her name was D.A.T.S. adjective I. That's near as I can set it down in our letters. It meant something to do with early morning, the light before the sun's up over the ridge. Marta got it out of the old man in pieces over the next hour, in his broken English and her patient quiet, while the child slept the deep suspicious sleep of a body deciding whether to keep living, and I built the fire up past sense and put the last of the coffee on, and did the useless orbiting a man does around a thing too big for him. Here is what we learned in pieces that night. The band had left the reservation, not to raid, to go. To get south to a place a few of the old ones remembered, where the government's lines didn't reach yet, because on the reservation the winter rations had come short a 3rd year running, and this year the shortness was going to be a killing shortness, and everyone with sense knew it. Nature's son, D.A.T.S. ejective IIS father, had been one of the men who organized the leaving, quiet at night, in small groups so the whole thing wouldn't show at once. And it had worked for a while. And then the weather had turned early and mean, the way it did the night Marta came, and the small groups had been caught strung out across 40 miles of open country by a storm that didn't care whose side anybody was on. Nature's group had scattered in the white. He'd had the child by the hand and then he hadn't. She'd been swept off in the dark the way you'd lose a hat, there and then gone, and he'd been 3 days finding the strip of red cloth he'd tied on her wrist himself, finding it snagged on brush, following the drift of her small tracks under fresh snow that kept trying to erase them, until the tracks led up the draw to a lamplit window and a barking dog, and he must have thought, seeing my door, the end of everything. A white man's ranch. He'd come up on it with his rifle ready and his heart already grieving, because in his experience, a white man's door at the end of an Apache child's tracks in a storm meant one of two things, and neither of them was mercy. And then he'd seen my face in the lamplight and known me. He told Marta this. Not me, Marta. He turned his whole story over to my wife within an hour of meeting her, this old man who'd survived 60 years by trusting no one across that line, and I stood in my own kitchen not entirely understanding why until I watched them together a while longer and understood it completely. It was the scar. It was the same thing the child had reached up to touch. Marta wore proof on her face that the world had hurt her and hadn't finished her, and there is a Freemasonry among the hurt that has nothing to do with tribe or tongue. And Nate had walked in out of the worst night of his life and found, tending his granddaughter, the one white face in that whole country that carried its damage on the outside where an honest man could read it. He trusted her because she couldn't hide, and a person who can't hide can't easily lie, and he'd staked the child's life on that reading the way I'd once staked a marriage on it. I got my little book down at some point past midnight. I know how it looks, I know, scribbling in a book while all this went on, but it's how I keep from coming apart, it always has been, and I wrote one line while the coffee boiled. 3 strangers and a child, and the only thing we've got in common is the weather wants us dead. Marta saw me writing. She didn't tell me to stop. She'd stopped telling me to stop somewhere in those first 11 days. She'd decided the book was part of how I loved things, and she let me love things my way, which is the largest thing anyone has ever done for me, and she did it without once making a speech about it. By the gray of morning, the storm had blown itself out and left the world scoured and blinding and silent, and D.A.T.S. ejective II was going to live. She woke a little past dawn and drank broth on her own and looked around my strange white man's kitchen with the flat, unreadable calm of a child who has already survived more than a child should have to and is only totting up the newest danger. Her eyes went to Nate first and eased. Then to Marta and eased more. She remembered the scarred face from the dark, remembered it was safe. Then to me and did not ease at all, and I didn't blame her one particle. I was the one thing in the room shaped like everything that had ever hurt her people. She watched me the way you'd watch a snake you weren't yet sure was dead. And I found this surprised me, that I could not stand for that child to be afraid of me, and that I would spend whatever it took of the coming days to change how she looked at me, and that this was now, somehow, without my deciding it, one of the central facts of my life. I have thought a great deal in the years since about how a man's whole self can rearrange itself around a thing in a single night. I went into that storm a man whose largest concern was his failing cattle. I came out of it a man who could not bear a 7-year-old's fear. Nobody asked me. It just happened, the way the snow just happened, and afterward it was simply the shape of the country I lived in. But morning brought the storm's end, and the storm's end brought the rest of the world back, and the rest of the world was the problem. Because they'd be looking. The army was out, the papers had said so, and Nate confirmed it grim over his coffee, and a band gone off the reservation in wintertime was exactly the kind of trouble the army existed to end, and they'd be sweeping this whole country as soon as the weather let them, and any ranch along the line would be a natural place to ask questions. And a rancher found harboring three of the very people the army was hunting, an old man, a child, and by then, God help us, whatever else came, that rancher would not be looked on as a good Samaritan. That rancher would be looked on as a friend to hostiles, which in that country and that year was a thing that got a man's stock confiscated at the kindest, and his neck stretched at the worst, and got his marked wife driven out to starve either way. I laid this out at the table in the flat morning light, all of it, holding nothing back, because holding things back was a thing I'd given up in that kitchen 11 days into a marriage. I said, they'll come. Maybe today, maybe in a week, but they'll come and they'll ask, and I'm the worst liar you ever saw. Marta made a small sound at that, almost a half smile, because it was the very thing she'd approved of me for on the first day, and if they find you here, it's the end of us. All of us. Not just you three. Her and me, this ranch, everything. Nate understood before I finished. He was already standing, already reaching for his still wet coat, already saying in his broken hard English that they would go now this morning, that we had done more than any of his people had a right to expect from any of mine, and that he would not repay it by hanging us. He meant it. He'd have walked that child back out into the scoured cold to save my neck, out of a sense of debt so fierce it was almost an insult, and I understood that if I let him do it, the child would die within the day, because there was nowhere to go. The band was scattered or taken. The South was 40 frozen miles off, and a 7-year-old 3 days out of death's mouth would not last a morning in that open white. He knew it too. That was the terrible thing. He knew it, and he was going to do it anyway, because he'd weighed a child's life against 3 strangers' lives and come down, grieving, on the side of the strangers who'd shown him kindness. That's the kind of man he was. I have not met his equal in my own people, and I've looked. No, I said. And that was the moment. That right there. That single flat word in my own kitchen in the cold morning light. That was the morally heavy thing this whole telling has been walking toward, and I want to be honest about how it came to me, because it did not come to me as courage. Courage is what men call a thing afterward when it turned out well. In the moment it came to me as something much smaller and much harder to argue with. I simply could not do the other thing. I could not open my door and put a child back into the snow to die so that I might keep my cattle and my good name. I turned it over. I truly did. I am not a good enough man to have not turned it over. I stood there, and I thought about the 40 acres and the 100 head and the neck under my collar and the town's tongue and everything I'd built and everything I stood to lose. I did the arithmetic. I want that on the record, and the arithmetic came out the same no matter how I ran it, because there was one number in it I couldn't move, and the number was DATS adjective II, 7 years old, watching me from the hearth with eyes that had decided I was a snake. No, I said again, you're not taking her back out there, neither of you, not today, not this week, not till she's strong and the country's clear and there's a real chance, and maybe not even then. I heard my own voice like it belonged to a braver man. I'll figure the army, I'll figure the town, that's mine to figure, and I'll do it. But I'm not, and here my voice did a thing I wasn't proud of, went thin because I felt the size of what I was saying. I am not putting a child in the snow to keep my cattle. I'd rather lose the cattle. I'd rather lose the whole thing. I've been losing it slow for months anyway, and it never once felt like this. Losing it for something that I can do, that I find I can do just fine. There was a silence. Marta crossed the kitchen and stood beside me and put her hand flat on my back between the shoulder blades and pressed, not a pat, not a stroke, just a steady press, weight, presence, the physical fact of I am here and I've chosen this with you and you are not standing in it alone. And I understood that she'd known I'd come here. She'd known before I did the night before, when she'd said she wouldn't hold a second dead child to keep the peace. She'd been waiting the whole cold morning for me to catch up to where she already was, and she'd not pushed me 1 inch, because she'd wanted the choice to be mine, wholly mine, so that when it cost us, and she knew it would cost us, I would never be able to lie to myself that she'd talked me into it. She'd given me the choice clean. That's a kind of love I didn't have a name for then and only half have one for now. Old Nate looked at the two of us a long time. The white man who wouldn't lie and his wife who couldn't hide. And whatever he saw, it broke something loose in his face that had been held tight for 60 years. And he sat back down at my table slow, an old man out of arguments, and he put one hand over his eyes, and his shoulders went once hard, and then he mastered it. And D-a-T-S adjective I, watching all of this from the hearth without a word. D-a-T-S adjective I got up out of her quilts on unsteady legs and crossed to her grandfather and leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her without uncovering his eyes, and the two of them just held on. That was the morning I gave away my old life. I didn't know that's what it was yet, but I gave it away in that kitchen with my wife's hand pressed flat between my shoulders, and I have never once, in all the years and all the cost, wished I'd kept it. We had 11 days. I know it was 11 because I counted them in the book. 11 days between the morning I said no at the table, and the afternoon the dust showed on the town road. And every one of those 11 days I lived braced for it. And every one of them I got up before light and did my chores with the rifle never far and my ears always cocked toward the draw. And every one of them the world gave us one more day, and we used them. We used them, God. We used them well. I've had richer years since and I've had easier ones, but I'm not sure I've had 11 days that held more living than those. All of us packed into that cabin with the danger sitting on the roof, teaching each other how to be a strange kind of family under a sentence none of us had earned. D-a-T-S adjective I got strong. Children do, it's the mercy of them. By the 4th day she was underfoot everywhere, and by the 6th she'd stopped watching me like a snake. It happened over the wooden horse of all things. I'd got Nate's old carving down off my mantle to show her, the one he'd traded me years back, and her eyes had gone huge, and she'd understood in a flash what it meant. That this white man and her grandfather had known each other before in the ordinary world as men who traded horses. That I was not a stranger her grandfather had thrown her upon. That there was a thread, old and thin but real, running back through the years connecting me to her people by way of nothing grander than fair dealing over livestock. She looked at me different after that, still careful, but different, like I'd been recategorized. And when, on the 8th day, I whittled her a horse of my own, a poor lopsided thing next to her grandfather's, Nate laughed out loud at it, the only time I heard him laugh, a rusty bark like my own. She took it anyway, and she kept it, and I found out years later she kept it her whole life. Marta and Nate built something in those days too, something I mostly watched from the outside and never fully got let into, and I didn't mind. They'd sit at the fire in the evenings and she'd get more of his English and give him more of her patience, and the two of them traded the coin of the badly used. I never heard most of what passed between them and I never asked. Some of it was in a language older than either of theirs, the plain wordless commerce of two people who have been marked by the world and refused to let the marking make them cruel. She was more herself in those 11 days than I'd yet seen her, the scar forgotten by everyone in the room including her, and I loved her so hard in that time it frightened me, because I could feel the sentence on the roof, and I knew you're not supposed to build a thing that beautiful directly under a falling axe. And here's the piece I've turned over most. In the years, the piece I set here for you to turn over too. Somewhere in those 11 days it stopped being a rescue and became a family, and that is exactly the thing that made what came next unbearable. If Nate and D-a-T-S adjective I had stayed strangers, we'd have grieved losing them the way you grieve a hard duty done. Instead, we loved them on purpose, with our eyes open, knowing they couldn't stay, because Marta said, and she was right, that a child owed a few good days of being loved out loud after what she'd been through, sentence or no sentence, and that we would not ration love to make the parting easier, because love rationed to make parting easier is just cowardice wearing kindness's coat. So we didn't ration it, and the parting, when it came, was going to be exactly as terrible as she'd promised. She always did tell me the true thing, even when the true thing had teeth. On the 11th day, a little past noon, with the sky gone that flat pewter that means more weather coming, Job stood up off the porch and pointed his old gray nose down the draw and began, low and steady and certain, to bark. I came out with the rifle. Marta came out behind me, and down the town road, maybe 2 miles off and closing, small under the pewter sky, was dust, a column of it, the slow, purposeful dust of men riding in order, riding with somewhere to be. Behind me in the doorway, I heard Marta take a TS adjective IIS hand, and I heard Nate, very quiet in his own tongue, begin to say a thing over and over that I did not need translated, because a man saying goodbye to the world sounds the same in every language God ever made. I raised my eyes off the dust just for a second, just for 1 second, and looked at the country I'd chosen. My failing ranch, my scarred wife, an old man praying and a child holding her breath, everything I had and everything I'd decided to lose, all of it standing in one doorway under one falling sky. Then I levered around into the rifle, and I stepped down off my porch to meet whatever was coming up my road. I met them at the gate, because a man who meets trouble at his gate looks less like a man with something in his house. That was the whole of my plan, if you can call it a plan. Stand at the gate. Be a rancher. Be so plainly, dully, honestly a rancher checking his fence after a storm that no one thought to look past me at the door. I had the rifle broken open over my arm the way you carry a gun you mean nobody harm with, and I'd sent the others back from the windows, and I stood in the cold with my breath smoking, and I watched the column resolve out of the dust into 6 riders, and I felt my heart going, and I made my face do nothing at all. It wasn't the army. That was the first turn, and it turned my stomach worse instead of better, because the army at least had rules, bad ones, cruel ones, but rules, procedures, a chain of men you could sometimes reason with. This was not that. This was 6 men from the town and the spreads around it, led by a big red-faced rancher named Coyle, whose land ran along the far side of the reservation line, and who'd lost stock to the leaving band, real stock, or so he said, and maybe it was true, I never knew, and who had gathered up 5 other angry men and a great deal of whiskey courage, and appointed himself the instrument of the country's justice. A posse. The ugliest word in that whole country, because a posse is what you call a mob that's decided it's the law. Coyle knew me. Not well. We'd never had trouble and never had friendship. I was the quiet Vance up the draw who kept to himself and had lately, the town noted, married a marked woman off a paper. He pulled up his horse at my gate and looked down at me and looked past me at the house, and I made myself not turn to follow his look. "Vance," he said, "you seen anything?" "Seen a storm kill 9 of my cows," I said. "Seen my north fence come down, that the anything you mean." A couple of the men laughed. Coyle didn't. Coyle had the flat, patient meanness of a man who's decided the day is going to go a certain way and is only waiting for the excuse. "You know what I mean. Bucks went off the reservation. We tracked a bunch of 'em scattered through this country in the storm. Some froze, we found 'em froze, some didn't." He leaned on the saddle horn. "Tracks come up this draw, Vance, toward your place, days back before the second snow buried 'em. So I'll ask you plain and you answer me plain. You got Indians on your land. And here it is. Here's the thing I have carried longest, the thing I set down in the book that same night with a hand that shook so bad I could barely read it back. Because I'd told Marta, told her flat, that I was the worst liar in the country. And it was true. It had always been true. And in that moment at the gate, with 6 armed men looking down at me and a child holding her breath in my house, I discovered that it was true right up until the exact moment it needed not to be, that a man who cannot lie to save his cattle or his pride or his own comfort turns out to be able to lie like Scripture when there's a 7-year-old behind him. I looked Coyle dead in the eye and I said, "No." I said it easy. I said it bored. I said it like a man who's been asked a fool question by a fool and wants to get back to his fence. I have never in my life been so calm on the outside and so screaming on the in, and I felt Marta's presence behind me in that shut house like a hand between my shoulder blades, though she was 30 feet away and couldn't have touched me. And I held Coyle's eyes, and I did not blink, and I lied to save a child, and I found it was the easiest true feeling thing I'd ever said. Tracks come up the draw, Coyle said. Draw's the only way up from the flat, I said. Everything that moves in this country comes up the draw, deer, wolves, your daddy probably, don't mean it come to my door. I let a little edge in, the edge of an honest man getting insulted. You want to search my place, Coyle, you say so, and I'll want to know by what right, seeing as I've buried 9 cows this week and got no time for it. Otherwise get off my gate. Storm's coming back and I've a fence down. It hung there. It hung on a knife. Coyle looked at me and I looked at Coyle, and one of the men behind him shifted and the horses blew steam, and somewhere in the house a child who did not fully understand the language understood the tone perfectly and kept herself still as stone. And I have wondered every year since what would have happened if Coyle had called it, if he'd said yes, we'll search, because I don't know what I'd have done. I truly don't. I like to think I'd have done something. But 6 armed men and a Brocopen rifle, and I'll never know. And not knowing is its own kind of scar. He didn't call it. That's the mercy and the shame of it both. He didn't call it because he was lazy and cold and half drunk, and I was convincing and the weather was coming, not because of any goodness anywhere. He straightened up and spat and said something about how I'd want to lock my stock up if I had any left, and he wheeled his horse, and the 6 of them went back down my draw into the pewter afternoon. And I stood at my gate not moving until the dust of them was gone, and then some while after, until my legs would hold me for the walk back to the house. Marta met me at the door. She didn't say anything. She'd heard enough through the wall to know. She took the rifle out of my hands because my hands weren't going to give it up on their own, and she set it aside, and she put her scarred face against my chest, and we stood in the doorway a while and shook, both of us. The delayed shaking of people who have been close to the edge of a thing and stepped back from it. Over her shoulder I could see Nate. He'd understood every bit of it, not the words but the shape, the 6 men and the lie and the leaving. And he was looking at me with something I'd never had off another man's face in my life, and I won't try to name it, because naming it would shrink it. I'll just say I'd spent 31 years being looked at as the quiet Vance who kept to himself. And in one afternoon at a gate I'd become, to one old Apache man, something else entirely, and I have valued that look above every good opinion I've earned before or since. They left 2 nights later. It had to be. We all knew it. The posse hadn't searched, but the posse would talk, and the army was still out there somewhere, and every day the 2 of them stayed under my roof was a day the sentence sat heavier. And there'd come, in the lull after the storm, word up the reservation grapevine that Nate could read and I couldn't, a runner. A sign I never fully knew that some of the scattered band had regrouped south and west, past the worst of the army's line, in the broken country the old ones remembered. A place to aim for, a thin chance. But Nate had made his whole life out of thin chances, and he knew a real one from a false one, and he said it was real. And I believed him because by then I'd have believed that man about near anything. I gave them what I could. I want that in the book too, not out of pride but out of accuracy. I gave them my second best horse, a steady old mare who knew snow and wouldn't quit. And I gave them what food we could spare and some we couldn't. And I gave Nate my father's heavy coat, the one I'd married in, because it was the warmest thing I owned, and he had 40 frozen miles to cross, and I had a stove. Marta made the child new clothes out of 3 days of not sleeping, proper warm clothes, doubled and lined, made to last a winter, and she sat up the last night finishing them by firelight with the scar throwing its shadow up the wall, and she didn't cry while she sewed, because Marta didn't cry while there was work in her hands. She saved it. She was good at saving things for their proper time. The last morning was clear and hard and blue, and cold enough to crack stone. I've tried 100 times to set down the parting, and I've failed 100 times, and I'll fail again here. So I'll just tell you the true small pieces, because the true small pieces are all I really trust. Nate took my hand, both his hands around my one, hard, the calluses of 60 years of horses and weather. He didn't have the English for what he wanted to say, and I could see him not have it, see him reach for it and not find it. And finally he stopped reaching and just held my hand and looked at me and said one word, my own name, Elias. The way you'd say a word you were setting down carefully so it wouldn't break, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything a longer speech would only have watered down. The ts adjective I wouldn't come to me at first. She stood by the mare with her grandfather's carved horse in one small fist and my poor lopsided one in the other, and she looked at me with those flat, careful eyes, and I understood she wasn't going to hug the white man goodbye, and I'd no right to want her to. But then Marta knelt down and said something low to her. I never learned what, and the child came to me, came right up to me, and she reached up, the way she'd reached up that first night at Marta's scarred cheek, and she touched my face once, checking it was real, filing it away. And then she turned and let her grandfather lift her up onto the mare, and she did not look at me again. And I have decided in the years since that she didn't look back because she was 7 and had already learned the thing it takes most of us a lifetime to learn, that some doors you have to walk through facing forward, or you'll never walk through them at all. Marta and ts adjective I though. That was the parting that near finished me, and I wasn't even in it. My wife knelt in the cold blue morning and held that Apache child against her, the two of them who'd found each other across a scarred cheek in the dark of the worst night of both their lives, and she held on, and the child held on, and neither of them said one word, and this time the work all finished, nothing left in her hands to save. This time Marta let it come. Quiet. No sound to speak of. Just her shoulders and the tears running down both sides of her face, the pulled eye and the good one, into the child's black hair. She'd told me the first day she couldn't promise beauty. And I stood in my dooryard watching my wife weep over a child that wasn't ours and never could be, giving her away with both hands into a hard chance and a cold country because keeping her would kill us all. And I want to tell you, I want to set it down as the truest thing in this whole long telling. I had never in my life seen anything so beautiful, and I never have since, and I never will. Then they were up on the horses. Then they were moving. Then they were small on the flat, and smaller, an old man and a child on a steady mare heading into the broken southern country toward a chance we'd never get word of one way or the other. We never did get word. That's the part folks always want and I never have to give them. I don't know if they made it. I've chosen all these years to believe they made it because the alternative is a thing I can't keep in the house with me, but choosing to believe isn't the same as knowing, and I won't pretend it is. Some mornings I'm sure they made it. Some mornings, the cold blue ones especially, I'm not sure of anything at all. The ranch didn't fail. I'll give you that much of a landing, because it's true, and because after all that cold you've earned a warm fact to hold. We came through that winter, Marta and I, the two of us, an old job and what cattle the storm had left us, and the next year was better and the one after that better still, and it turned out that a failing spread was mostly a spread that had been trying to run itself with one grieving man, and that two people who'd chosen each other with their eyes open could make it live. She was right that first day in the kitchen. She could save a house. She saved mine. She saved considerably more than the house. We never had children of our own. I'll set that down plain and not make more of it than it is. It grieved us some, and we made our peace with it, and we filled the years with other things, the way people do, and there were long stretches I forgot to grieve it at all. But I'll tell you what I noticed, and I noticed it slow, over years, the way you notice the shape of your own life only long after it's set. Marta kept a strip of red cloth in her sewing box until the day she died. She never said why. I never asked. I knew why. And every winter, the first hard storm, she'd stand at the window a while looking down the draw with her scarred face still and her eyes far off. And I never said anything then either. I'd just come and stand behind her and put my hand flat between her shoulder blades, weight and presence, the thing she'd taught me without ever teaching me. I am here and I chose this with you, and you are not standing in it alone. I've filled a shelf of books since that winter. Cattle and Coin, and the other kind, the back way out kind my mother started me on. But I've never written down the whole of that winter until now, because some things you keep whole by not touching them, and I'm only setting it down at all because I'm old now and books get lost, and I find I can't stand for it to be lost. The child in the snow, the old man in my kitchen, my wife weeping in the blue cold, the morning I found out what I was made of by finding out I couldn't do the other thing. She told me she couldn't promise beauty, only a loving home. She was wrong about the first part. She was so wrong about the first part that I've spent a lifetime failing to say how wrong, and I'm failing at it now, and I'll stop trying. But the loving home she promised, that she made out of a failing ranch and a scarred face and a stranger who couldn't lie and one impossible winter that asked us both, at a gate, in a kitchen, in a blue cold dooryard, exactly who we were. I answered, she answered. Some mornings, the cold blue ones, I stand at the window and look down the draw and I